My mom called to celebrate that my best friend was ruled as innocent. But he's not. He's a diagnosed sociopath, and I'm the one who turned him in. My phone slipped out of my hand and hit the ground. Through the speaker, I could hear her talking about how amazing this was and how she'd already talked to Zeke and arranged for us to meet. My hands were shaking because I knew what that meant. I left work immediately, speeding home, trying to remember if I'd been careful enough with that anonymous tip. 3 months ago, I watched Zeke pistol whip a jewelry store owner until his face was unrecognizable. The old man begged, said he had grandchildren, but Zeke just kept hitting him. I got home and deadbolted every lock, then pushed my couch against the front door. The last thing Zeke had said in court when they dismissed the charges was, "Someone's going to pay with their life for this." He'd looked right at me when he said it. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. A photo of my house taken 5 minutes ago. I was in the window, visible through the curtains. Another text. "Remember what I told you about snitches?" I grabbed the baseball bat from my closet and checked every window. Nothing. Then I heard it. The sound of glass cutting. The bathroom window. I ran toward it, but Zeke was already inside, holding a crowbar. "Hey, brother." 3 months was a long time to think about who knew enough to call in that tip. I swung the bat, but he was ready, deflecting it with the crowbar. The impact sent vibrations up my arms. He said, "The tooth. You were the only one who saw me take it." He meant the store owner's tooth he'd knocked out and pocketed as a trophy. I'd been so disgusted that night sitting in my car while he counted the bloody bills. He said, "That old man died last week. Heart failure from the trauma. That makes us both killers." I said, "I tried to stop you." But he laughed. "You took your cut. $20,000. What did you spend it on? Your mom's chemo?" The guilt hit me like a punch. I had used it for her treatment. Every dollar. She'd needed it so badly, and I told myself it was different because I was saving a life, not taking one. But blood money was blood money. Zeke swung the crowbar at my head. I ducked and it went through the drywall. I ran for the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the block. He followed, casual and confident. He said, "You know what's funny? The charges got dropped, but everyone still thinks I'm guilty. My girl left. My dad won't look at me. But you get to play the supportive friend." He knocked the knife away with one swing of the crowbar, forcing me to back up against the counter. "I kept the security footage from that night," he continued. "You're right there, clear as day, loading bags into your car. Your license plate is visible." "You're lying," I responded. But he pulled out his phone and showed me. There I was, my face plastered on screen, carrying jewelry bags to my trunk. My stomach dropped. "I also buried some pieces in your backyard last night, while you were sleeping, the expensive stuff." I grabbed a pan and swung it at his face. It connected with his jaw, and he staggered. I ran for my phone, but he tackled me in the hallway. We crashed through my coffee table, glass exploding everywhere. He got on top, pressing the crowbar against my throat. He said, "Here's what happens. You confess to everything. Say you planned it, that I was just muscle you hired. Or I send this video to the cops along with an anonymous tip about your backyard." I couldn't breathe. Black spots filled my vision. I grabbed a shard of glass, slicing my own palm, and stabbed it into his thigh. He screamed and rolled off. I crawled away, but he grabbed my ankle, dragging me back through the broken glass. My shirt tore, and I felt glass embedding in my back. He stood over me, pulling the shard from his leg. Blood poured down his jeans. He said, "You were my best friend. 8 years. I would have done anything for you." I said, "You became a monster." He raised the crowbar high. "And you helped me. You enabled this." I rolled as the crowbar smashed into the floor where my head had been. I grabbed the broken bat and drove the splintered end into his stomach. He gasped and dropped the crowbar. Blood spread across his shirt. I stood up, but he pulled out a pistol. I froze. He aimed it at my head, his hand steady despite the blood loss. He said, "Confession or death. Choose now." I said, "If you shoot me, the neighbors will call the cops." He smiled, blood on his teeth. "I'll be gone, and they'll find a dead accomplice with stolen jewelry in his yard. Case closed." The barrel was trained on my forehead. He cocked it and said, 5 seconds to decide. 5, 4, 3. I heard sirens in the distance. His eyes flicked toward the window for just a second. I dove for the crowbar, but he fired. The bullet grazed my shoulder, spinning me into the wall. He aimed again, his finger tightening on the trigger. He said, "Last chance. Confess or die." I dove for the crowbar on the floor as the gun fired, the bullet punching through the drywall where my head was a second ago. Zeke cursed and adjusted his aim, but I was already rolling behind the couch I'd pushed against the door earlier. He fired twice more into the couch, and I felt the impacts shake through the frame as stuffing exploded around me. I heard sirens getting louder outside, and Zeke muttered something vicious before his footsteps pounded toward the back of the house. I peeked around the couch edge just as he crashed through the already broken bathroom window, blood trailing behind him from the stomach wound I gave him. The sirens were right outside now, and I collapsed against the wall, my shoulder burning where the bullet grazed me. 2 police officers kicked in my front door with weapons drawn, shouting commands while I raised my shaking hands. One officer secured me while the other cleared the house room by room, their radios crackling with updates about a bleeding suspect fleeing on foot. The officer holding me kept asking if I was hurt, and I nodded toward my shoulder where blood was soaking through my shirt. An EMT arrived within minutes and cut away my shirt to examine the gunshot graze across my shoulder. She cleaned and bandaged it while asking questions about what happened, but I was barely processing her words through the adrenaline crash. My ears were ringing from the gunshots and my hands wouldn't stop shaking no matter how hard I tried to control them. The EMT kept talking in a calm voice, explaining what she was doing, but the words seemed to come from far away. I watched her work on my shoulder like I was watching it happen to someone else. Detective Marshall Cleary showed up 40 minutes later, a tired-looking man in his 50s who studied the crime scene with careful attention. He photographed the bullet holes, the broken glass, the blood trail leading from my living room through the bathroom to the window. I sat on my couch wrapped in a blanket the EMT had given me, watching him move through my destroyed house with methodical precision. He crouched down to examine the coffee table wreckage, then studied the crowbar lying in a pool of blood on my hallway floor. Cleary asked me to walk him through what happened, and I told him everything except the part about the anonymous tip. I explained about Zeke's acquittal, the threatening texts, the home invasion, his demands that I confess to planning the robbery. The detective's expression hardened when I mentioned the security footage and buried jewelry, and he immediately called for a warrant. He explained they need to secure the backyard before Zeke or anyone else can remove evidence. Officers strung crime scene tape around my property while I sat on my front steps wrapped in a blanket. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I kept seeing Zeke's finger tightening on that trigger. The neighborhood was lit up with red and blue lights, and I could see curtains moving in windows across the street as people watched. Cleary pointed out disturbed soil in 3 spots in my backyard, exactly where Zeke said he'd buried the jewelry. The detective's face was grim as he explained they'll need to wait for the warrant before digging, which could take hours. He asked if I had somewhere else to stay tonight, and I shook my head because I didn't want to explain this mess to anyone. The forensics team arrived and started documenting everything with cameras and measuring tools. They collected the bullets from my walls, bagged the crowbar, swabbed blood samples from multiple locations. I watched them work and realized my entire life was now evidence in a criminal case. My phone started buzzing in my pocket while I sat there watching the forensics team bag blood samples. I pulled it out and saw Mom's number. My thumb hovered over the decline button, but I knew that would make things worse. I answered, and her voice came through frantic, asking if I was okay, because she'd heard on her police scanner app that there were multiple units at an address that sounded like mine. I told her I was fine, just a break-in attempt, nothing serious. The lie came out smooth and easy like I'd been practicing it. She asked if I was sure, and I said yeah. The cops scared him off before anything happened. I hated how natural the deception felt after years of being Zeke's friend and covering for his smaller crimes before everything escalated to this. She said she was relieved and made me promise to call if I needed anything. I promised and ended the call, then looked down at my bloody shirt and the EMT watching me from across the room. The EMT came over and said I needed to go to the hospital for proper treatment and documentation of the gunshot wound. I started to argue that the bandage was fine, but Cleary cut in saying the injury report would be crucial evidence for the case. The detective explained they needed official medical records showing the bullet graze, photographs from the hospital, everything documented in case this went to trial. I nodded because I was too tired to fight about it. The EMT called for an ambulance while Cleary told his officers to stay and secure the house until the warrant came through. I watched them string more tape across my front door as the ambulance pulled up with lights flashing but no siren. 2 paramedics came in with a stretcher, but I said I could walk. They insisted I sit down anyway and checked my blood pressure while asking questions about the injury. One of them cut away more of my shirt to examine the wound and said it looked clean, but definitely needed proper medical attention. The ambulance ride took maybe 10 minutes with me lying on the stretcher staring at the ceiling while one paramedic monitored my vitals. My shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and I could feel dried blood cracking on my skin. We pulled into the emergency room bay, and they wheeled me through automatic doors into harsh fluorescent lighting. A nurse took my information while I sat in a wheelchair. Then they moved me to a bed in a curtained area. I waited maybe 20 minutes before a doctor showed up, a woman in her 40s who looked exhausted. She examined my shoulder carefully, turning my arm to see the full extent of the graze. She said I was lucky the bullet only grazed me, maybe an inch to the left, and it would have shattered my collarbone. They cleaned the wound thoroughly with something that burned worse than the original injury, then gave me a tetanus shot in my other arm. The doctor prescribed antibiotics and said to watch for signs of infection. A nurse came in with a camera and photographed the injury from multiple angles for the police report. Each flash made me flinch and I had to hold still while she documented everything. My phone rang again while the nurse was finishing up the photos. I saw my boss's name and my stomach dropped. I answered and he asked why I'd left work in the middle of my shift without any explanation. I told him there was an emergency and I'd explain tomorrow. His voice went cold, and he said this wasn't the first time I'd been unreliable lately, and that my job might be in jeopardy if I couldn't provide a good reason. I wanted to scream that I'd been shot, but instead I just said I understood and would talk to him first thing in the morning. He hung up without saying goodbye. The nurse gave me discharge papers and instructions for wound care. Then a hospital security guard walked me out to the waiting area, where a police officer was waiting to drive me home. We got back to my house near midnight, and I could see portable lights set up in my backyard, bright white beams cutting through the darkness. Cleary was still there supervising the warrant execution, standing near my back fence with his arms crossed. Officers with shovels were carefully digging in the 3 spots he'd marked earlier, removing dirt 1 layer at a time. I went inside through the front door and walked to my kitchen window to watch. The officers were being methodical, photographing each stage of the excavation. I stood there with growing dread, knowing they were going to find exactly what Zeke said they would. One officer called out, and Cleary moved to the first hole. Even from the window, I could see them pulling out a black waterproof bag. They opened it right there, and I watched Cleary photograph the contents before carefully removing items one by one. Diamond rings caught the portable lights and threw sparkles across the dirt. Expensive watches with metal bands, more jewelry than I could identify from this distance. The officer moved to the second hole and started digging deeper. 20 minutes later, they hit something and pulled out another waterproof bag. This one had gold necklaces and earrings that Cleary laid out on a tarp for documentation. The third hole took longer because it was deeper, but eventually they found the last bag. This one contained loose gemstones in small plastic bags and a distinctive emerald bracelet that even I could see was expensive. My legs felt weak and I had to lean against the counter. Cleary photographed everything in place before bagging each piece as evidence. Then he came inside through my back door and found me in the kitchen. He had his phone out and showed me pictures from the original robbery case. Crime scene photos of the jewelry store's display cases, smashed and empty. Close-ups of individual pieces that had been reported stolen. I recognized several items immediately. The emerald bracelet was right there in the case file, the same one they'd just dug up from my yard. I remembered the store owner showing it to Zeke, explaining it was an anniversary gift someone had commissioned. Zeke had smiled and nodded, and then started hitting him. Cleary watched my face as I looked at the photos, and I knew he could see the recognition there. The detective put his phone away and explained that Ada Zara Jefferson would review everything in the morning to determine what charges to file. He said her name like I should know who she was. Then he warned me that the planted evidence in my yard combined with Zeke's security footage put me in a complicated legal position. He wasn't arresting me tonight, but I should expect to hear from the prosecutor's office soon. I should probably get a lawyer. He said this almost gently, like he felt bad about it. Then he and his team packed up their equipment and left, taking the evidence bags with them. I locked the door behind them and stood in my destroyed living room surrounded by crime scene tape and dried blood. I tried to sleep that night but couldn't make myself go to my bedroom. It felt too exposed, too far from the exits. I lay on my couch instead with my baseball bat on the floor next to me. Every sound made me jump. A car passing outside, the house settling, the refrigerator humming. I kept seeing Zeke's finger on that trigger, kept feeling the bullet graze my shoulder. My phone was on the coffee table and I stared at it, half expecting another threatening text. But nothing came. Zeke was long gone, probably getting that stab wound treated somewhere. Or maybe he was bleeding out in a ditch. Part of me hoped for that, but another part felt sick at the thought. 8 years of friendship doesn't just disappear even when someone tries to kill you. I dozed off around 4 in the morning and woke up an hour later from a nightmare where Zeke was standing over me with the crowbar. My phone rang at 7 in the morning and I grabbed it fast, my heart already racing. Mom's name on the screen. I answered and her voice came through tight with worry. She said the news was reporting a shooting and home invasion at an address she recognized. She asked if that was my house. I couldn't lie to her anymore. My voice cracked when I said, yeah, that was me. She went quiet for a long moment. Then she asked if I was hurt, and I told her about the bullet graze. She started crying and asking what happened and who did this. I said I needed to tell her everything, but not over the phone. I asked her to come over so we could talk. She said she'd be there in an hour and hung up. I sat there holding the phone, knowing that in 60 minutes I'd have to explain how her chemotherapy was paid for with blood money from a robbery that left an old man dead. She pulled into my driveway 50 minutes later and got out of her car looking pale and shaky. I opened the door before she could knock and she grabbed me in a hug that hurt my bandaged shoulder. She pulled back and saw the blood on my shirt and the crime scene tape still hanging from my doorframe. I walked her inside and she stared at the destruction, the broken coffee table, the bullet holes in my walls, the dried blood on the floor. She asked what happened and I told her about Zeke breaking in through the bathroom window, about him threatening me with the crowbar and then the gun. I showed her where the bullet grazed my shoulder and she started crying. She asked why Zeke would do this and I explained about the anonymous tip that got him arrested, how he figured out I was the one who called it in. I didn't mention that I'd been there that night or taken money from the robbery. I definitely didn't tell her where the money for her chemo had really come from. She sat on my couch and held my hand and said we needed to call the police if we hadn't already. I told her they'd already been here, that detectives were handling it, that Zeke was on the run now. My phone rang and I saw my boss's name on the screen. I answered and he started yelling before I could say anything. He demanded to know where I was and why I'd abandoned my shift yesterday without any explanation or approval. I tried to explain about the emergency, but he talked over me, saying this was the final straw after multiple attendance issues. I interrupted him and said I got shot, that I have an emergency room report with my name on it and a police case number. That stopped him mid-sentence and he went quiet for a few seconds. He asked if I was serious and I said yes, completely serious. I can email him the hospital paperwork right now. His tone changed a bit, and he said to send the documentation and take a few days to recover. but we'd need to discuss my future with the company when I returned. I could hear the doubt in his voice, like he thought I might be making this up. I hung up and my mom asked if I was going to lose my job. I said probably yeah, but that was the least of my problems right now. My phone rang again an hour later and it was Detective Cleary. He said they'd finished executing the search warrant on my property and found exactly what Zeke claimed they would find. 3 separate burial sites in my backyard, all containing stolen jewelry from the original robbery case. He asked me to come to the station that afternoon to give a formal statement about everything that happened. I agreed, but told him I needed to get a lawyer first. He said that was probably smart given the circumstances and gave me until tomorrow morning. After I hung up, my mom asked what that was about, and I had to explain about Zeke burying evidence in my yard while I was sleeping. She looked horrified and asked if the police thought I was involved in the robbery. I said I didn't know what they thought, but I needed legal help either way. I spent the next 2 hours searching online for criminal defense attorneys in the area. I found one named Justina Ashby, with good reviews and a lot of experience with felony cases. I called her office and explained my situation to her assistant, who put me through to Justina directly. She listened to my summary of events and agreed to meet me before my police interview tomorrow. Her retainer fee was $3,500, which wiped out most of my savings account, but I didn't have much choice. I gave her my credit card information over the phone, and she scheduled me for 8 in the morning at her office. That evening, I tried to clean up some of the mess in my house, but everything felt overwhelming. My mom helped me sweep up the broken glass, and we moved the destroyed coffee table to the curb. She kept looking at me with this worried expression, and finally asked if I was really okay. I said no, not really, but I'd figure it out. She stayed until almost midnight before heading home, making me promise to call her if anything else happened. After she left, I sat in the dark living room with my baseball bat next to me, jumping at every sound outside. I barely slept and was exhausted when my alarm went off at 6:30. I showered carefully around my shoulder bandage and drove to Justina's office downtown. She met me in a conference room with a legal pad and a recorder. She had me walk through everything from the beginning, the robbery 3 months ago, taking the money, the anonymous tip, Zeke's trial and acquittal, the threatening texts, the home invasion, all of it. Her expression got more serious with each detail I shared. When I finished, she sat back and said I was in genuine legal danger. The evidence suggested I was involved in the original robbery, regardless of what Zeke did to me afterward. She explained that accepting stolen money and helping transport stolen goods made me an accessory after the fact at minimum. I asked what that meant for me, and she said it depended on whether the prosecutor wanted to charge me, but I could be looking at felony charges and potential prison time. My phone buzzed on the table between us and I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. A text message with a screenshot attached. I opened it and saw a news article about the jewelry store owner dying from heart failure related to trauma from the assault. The message below the screenshot said they found the jewelry, and I was going down with him. The text was signed Brother, which is what Zeke always called me. I showed it to Justina, and she immediately asked if she could forward it to Detective Cleary. I said yes, and she sent it from her own phone with a message explaining this was evidence of continued threats and witness intimidation. She told me to change my phone number as soon as possible and avoid any contact with Zeke or anyone connected to him. She said these texts proved Zeke was actively trying to intimidate me, and that would help my case. We finished our meeting, and she drove with me to the police station for my formal statement. Detective Cleary was waiting in an interview room with another detective I didn't recognize. Justina sat next to me and told them I was prepared to give a full statement about the home invasion, but would not be answering questions about the original robbery at this time. Cleary nodded and started the recording. I spent 90 minutes walking through every detail of Zeke's attack, from the threatening texts, to the bathroom window, to the gun, to the bullet that grazed my shoulder. Cleary asked specific questions about what Zeke said and did, about the crowbar and the pistol and the security footage he showed me. I answered everything as clearly as I could while Justina took notes next to me. When we finished, Cleary said they were pursuing multiple charges against Zeke, including home invasion, aggravated assault, and witness intimidation. He thanked me for my cooperation and said he'd be in touch. Justina and I left the station and she told me to go home and try to rest. She said she'd start working on my defense strategy and would call me in a few days. I drove home feeling exhausted and scared about what came next. I got back to my house around 2 in the afternoon and found my neighbor Alvin Pugh standing on my front porch holding a ladder. He said he was returning it from 3 weeks ago when I'd let him borrow it to clean his gutters. I thanked him and took the ladder, but he didn't leave. He looked uncomfortable and asked if everything was okay, mentioning he'd seen all the police activity the other night. I said there'd been a break-in, but I was fine. He nodded and then said something that made my stomach drop. He said he'd seen a guy running through the yards that night, limping badly with blood all over his shirt. He described someone who matched Zeke perfectly, said the guy had jumped his fence and cut through toward the main road. I asked what time that was, and he said around 9:30, maybe 9:45. I immediately called Detective Cleary and told him what Alvin had just said. Cleary asked to speak with Alvin directly, and I handed my neighbor the phone. Alvin repeated his statement and gave more details about which direction Zeke had run and what he was wearing. Cleary said he'd send an officer over immediately to take a formal statement. The next morning, Cleary called me with more news. He said they'd pulled footage from my doorbell camera, which I didn't even know I had since it came with the rental house. The footage showed a car driving past my house multiple times on the day of the invasion, always slowing down near my driveway. They'd gotten a partial license plate from one of the passes and run it through their system. The plate fragment matched a vehicle registered to someone named Marcus Webb, who had known connections to Zeke from previous arrests. Cleary said this proved Zeke had been planning the attack and doing surveillance beforehand. He asked if I knew Marcus Webb, and I said no, I'd never heard that name before. Cleary said they were trying to locate Webb for questioning and would keep me updated. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table feeling like the walls were closing in. Every day brought new evidence, new complications, new reasons to panic about my future. I knew I was in serious trouble, and no amount of cooperation was going to erase what I'd done. That afternoon, Cleary called again and said he'd been talking with ADA Zara Jefferson about my case. He explained that Jefferson had been the prosecutor on Zeke's original robbery case, the one that got dismissed. She was frustrated because she'd known Zeke was guilty, but couldn't prove it beyond reasonable doubt. The case had fallen apart due to chain of custody issues with evidence and a key witness who recanted their statement at the last minute. Jefferson had reviewed all the new evidence from the home invasion and the buried jewelry, and she wanted to meet with me and my attorney to discuss options. Cleary said Jefferson was considering whether to charge me as an accessory, but she might be willing to work out a cooperation deal if I testified against Zeke. I told him I'd talk to Justina and get back to him. I hung up and stared at my phone, knowing that whatever happened next would determine whether I went to prison or not. I called Justina right after hanging up with Cleary, and she answered on the second ring. She told me to meet her at her office in an hour, and to bring any documentation I had about the robbery or Zeke's threats. I drove across town with my hands gripping the wheel too tight, watching every car behind me like it might be Zeke somehow. Her office was in a small building near the courthouse and smelled like old coffee and paper. She sat me down in a chair across from her desk and opened a legal pad. She started by saying I needed to understand something critical. I could not talk to police without her present anymore. Not Cleary, not anyone, not even to answer what seemed like simple questions. She explained that everything I said could be used against me, and that cops were good at making conversations seem casual when they were actually building a case. I nodded and she continued, asking about cooperation options. She said prosecutors sometimes offered deals to people who testified against bigger targets, but any deal would require complete honesty. That meant admitting I took money from the robbery. That meant admitting I helped move stolen jewelry. That meant confessing to being an accessory, even though I didn't plan the crime or hurt anyone. My stomach felt sick, but I told her I understood. She warned me the next few weeks would get worse before they got better. Evidence would come out. People would judge me. My life would be examined in ways that felt invasive and unfair. She asked if I was ready for that, and I said I didn't have a choice. 2 days passed in a blur of anxiety and waiting. I went to work but couldn't focus on anything. My phone stayed in my pocket on silent because I couldn't handle more bad news. Then my boss called me into his office right before lunch on Thursday. He had his computer turned toward me showing a news website. The headline read, "New Evidence in Jewelry Store Robbery Case," and below it was a still image from security footage. The image showed me loading black bags into my car trunk. My face was clearly visible under a streetlight. My license plate was right there in the frame. My boss asked if I wanted to explain what he was looking at. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. He said the company couldn't have employees under investigation for violent felonies. He said I was suspended without pay, effective immediately pending the outcome of the legal proceedings. He asked for my building access card, and I handed it over. I walked out of his office past coworkers who stared at me with a mix of curiosity and disgust. Someone had already seen the news. Everyone would know by the end of the day. I got home and my phone was ringing. It was my mom. I almost didn't answer, but I knew she'd just keep calling. I picked up and she was crying. Her voice came through broken and desperate, asking me if what she saw on the news was real. She asked if I was really involved in that robbery. She asked if I helped that man who killed the store owner. I sat down on my couch and felt everything inside me collapse. I told her yes. I told her I was there that night. I told her I took money from what Zeke stole. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought she'd hung up. Then she asked how much money. I told her $20,000. She asked what I did with it, and I started crying. I told her I used it to pay for her chemotherapy. I told her the bills were piling up and I was drowning and I didn't know what else to do. The silence came back even heavier than before. She finally spoke and asked me how I could do this to her. Her voice sounded hollow, like something had broken inside her. I tried to explain about being desperate and watching her suffer and feeling helpless. I told her I thought I was saving her life. She cut me off and said she would have rather died than have me become a criminal. She said she would have rather died than know her son helped hurt an innocent man. She said that old man had grandchildren just like she had a son, and now those grandchildren had to grow up knowing their grandfather died because of people like me. Those words hit me harder than anything Zeke had done. The crowbar and the gun and the threats were nothing compared to hearing my mom say she wished she'd died instead of accepting my help. She hung up without saying goodbye. I sat there staring at my phone for a long time. Then Cleary called saying they'd recovered the bullet from my wall. He explained they dug it out carefully and sent it to the lab for ballistics analysis. He said if they caught Zeke and found the gun, they could match the bullet to prove he shot me. But without the actual weapon, it was just circumstantial evidence. He said the bullet showed the caliber and some rifling marks, but that wasn't enough for a conviction by itself. He needed the gun. He asked if I had any idea where Zeke might have stashed it, and I said no. Zeke was too smart to keep evidence around. He'd probably already dumped it in a river or buried it somewhere nobody would ever find it. The next day, Justina called saying she'd set up a meeting with ADA Jefferson. She explained that Jefferson had been frustrated when Zeke's original case fell apart, and now she was interested in building a new case using the home invasion and planted evidence. Jefferson wanted to discuss cooperation, but Justina warned me not to get my hopes up. She said my credibility as a witness was damaged because of my own criminal involvement. She said Jefferson would be cautious about cutting deals with someone who took money from a violent felony. We met at the courthouse in a small conference room. Jefferson was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She laid out the situation clearly. She said they had evidence against me. She said they had evidence against Zeke. She said the question was whether I could help them build a stronger case in exchange for reduced charges. She asked me to walk through everything I knew about the robbery, and I did. I told her about watching Zeke beat the store owner. I told her about the tooth he kept as a trophy. I told her about counting the bloody money in my car. Jefferson took notes and asked specific questions about times and locations. When I finished, she leaned back and said my testimony could be useful, but my friendship with Zeke complicated things. Juries didn't trust witnesses who were also criminals. Juries didn't trust people who waited months to come forward. She said she'd think about what kind of deal might be possible. I got home that afternoon and my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a video file. I opened it and felt my blood turn cold. The video showed me sitting in my car on the night of the robbery. I was counting cash. Bills were spread across my lap and my hands were shaking as I sorted them into stacks. My face was clearly visible in the dome light. I looked sick and scared, but I was still counting the money. The video was only 30 seconds long, but it was enough to destroy any credibility I had left. I immediately forwarded it to Justina with a message saying, "Zeke sent this." She called me 5 minutes later and I could hear her frustration. She said this video made everything worse. She said it showed me actively participating in the proceeds of a violent crime. She said accepting stolen property and benefiting from a felony made me an accessory after the fact at minimum. She said prosecutors could argue I was more involved than I claimed. She said the video showed me looking guilty and scared, which would play badly in court. She asked if there was anything else I hadn't told her, and I swore there wasn't. She said we needed to be completely honest going forward because every new piece of evidence made my situation more complicated. 2 days later, Cleary called with a new idea. He said they were having trouble finding Zeke and wondered if I'd be willing to help draw him out. He suggested I wear a wire and arrange to meet Zeke somewhere public. He said if Zeke showed up and made threats or admissions about the robbery, they'd have him on tape. I told him that sounded dangerous and he admitted it was risky, but said they'd have officers nearby for protection. I said I needed to talk to Justina first. When I called her, she was immediately skeptical. She said using me as bait raised serious safety and legal concerns. She said if something went wrong, I could get hurt or killed. She said any evidence gathered might be challenged in court if the setup wasn't done properly. She said she'd only consider it if we could get solid immunity guarantees in writing. She said she wanted something from the prosecutor that protected me from additional charges if Zeke said something incriminating during the meeting. Cleary said he'd talk to Jefferson about it. A week later, Jefferson sent over a draft cooperation agreement. Justina reviewed it with me in her office and explained what it meant. The agreement offered reduced charges in exchange for my testimony against Zeke, but it didn't promise full immunity. It required me to plead guilty to accessory charges. It required me to accept probation. It required me to pay money back to the victim's family. The amount would be based on how much I took from the robbery. Justina said this was probably the best deal I was going to get. She said if I went to trial and lost, I could face years in prison. She said if I cooperated and testified truthfully, I'd probably avoid jail time, but I'd have a criminal record and financial debt for years. She asked what I wanted to do, and I told her I needed time to think about it. She said I had 48 hours before Jefferson pulled the offer off the table. I left Justina's office and drove home in a fog. My apartment felt empty and cold when I walked in. I tried calling my mom, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried again an hour later. Same thing. She was ignoring me, and I couldn't blame her. My shoulder was throbbing where the bullet had grazed it, and I swallowed 2 pain pills before lying down on my couch. Sleep didn't come. I stared at the ceiling, counting the hours until Jefferson's deadline. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Zeke's face or the security footage of me loading those bags into my car. The cooperation deal meant admitting everything in open court. It meant my mom hearing all the details. It meant everyone knowing I'd helped a monster because I was desperate. But going to trial without a deal meant risking years in prison if the jury didn't believe me. Justina had explained it clearly enough. The prosecution could paint me as an equal partner in the robbery. They had evidence showing I took money and transported stolen goods. My anonymous tip might look like an attempt to eliminate competition or settle a score. I grabbed my phone and texted my mom again, asking her to please call me back. Nothing. At 3 in the morning, I finally dozed off and woke up 2 hours later to my phone buzzing. Unknown number. My stomach twisted as I opened the message. It was an address on the industrial side of town. An abandoned warehouse. The text said to come alone at 8 tonight if I wanted to talk. I knew it was Zeke. I called Cleary immediately and he answered on the second ring. I read him the message and he was silent for a moment before telling me this could be our chance to get Zeke on tape making threats or admitting to the robbery. He said he'd set up surveillance around the warehouse and have officers ready to move in if things went bad. I told him I needed to talk to Justina first. She called me back 20 minutes later, and I could hear the concern in her voice when I explained about Zeke's text. She said walking into that warehouse was dangerous and potentially stupid. She said Zeke could be planning to kill me and make it look like I'd fled or disappeared. She said any evidence gathered might not be admissible if the setup wasn't done right. But she also said if we did this with proper backup and safety measures, it might give us leverage with Jefferson. She said she'd only agree if Cleary provided detailed safety protocols and backup plans in writing. Cleary sent over the operational plan that afternoon. It showed officer positions around the warehouse perimeter. It included radio frequencies and emergency signals. It outlined response procedures if Zeke became violent. Justina reviewed it and called me to say she was still nervous, but the plan looked reasonably solid. She made me promise to follow Cleary's instructions exactly and to abort if anything felt wrong. Cleary met me at the police station at 6 that evening. He took me into a small room where a technician was waiting with equipment. The tech fitted me with a wire that clipped to my belt with a tiny microphone that attached under my shirt collar. He showed me how the battery pack worked and tested the audio quality, while Cleary listened through headphones. The detective explained that backup units would be positioned in unmarked vehicles around the warehouse. He said officers would be watching through scopes and thermal imaging. He said I needed to keep Zeke talking and get him to admit details about the original robbery and the home invasion. He coached me on asking open questions that would make Zeke explain things rather than just confirm yes or no. He told me to mention specific items from the robbery to see if Zeke would talk about selling them or hiding them. He said if Zeke pulled a weapon or made any move to hurt me, I should hit the ground immediately and officers would move in. We went over the plan 3 more times until Cleary was satisfied I understood. Then he drove me to my car and followed me most of the way to the warehouse location before peeling off to join the surveillance team. I pulled into the warehouse parking lot at 7:55. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. The building was massive and dark with broken windows along the upper floors. Weeds grew through cracks in the pavement, and trash was scattered everywhere. I scanned the lot for Zeke's car but didn't see it. No other vehicles were visible. I sat there for 2 minutes trying to calm down before opening my door. The wire felt obvious under my shirt, even though the tech had assured me it was invisible. I walked toward the main entrance of the warehouse. The metal door was slightly open and I could see nothing but darkness inside. My phone showed 8 o'clock exactly. I was about to step through the door when Cleary's voice crackled in my earpiece, making me jump. He said they'd spotted a vehicle leaving the backside of the property at high speed. He said it looked like Zeke's car based on the partial plate they'd caught. He told me to stay put and not enter the building. I stood frozen in the parking lot listening to radio chatter through my earpiece. Officers were pursuing the vehicle, but Zeke was driving fast and running lights. Someone reported losing visual contact near the highway entrance. Another voice said the vehicle had disappeared into traffic. Cleary's voice came back telling me to return to my car. He said Zeke had somehow detected the surveillance and fled before I even got inside. I drove back to the station feeling like a failure. The backup team had lost Zeke's vehicle completely, and I was left standing in an empty parking lot having accomplished nothing. Cleary met me in the same room where they'd fitted the wire and helped me remove the equipment. He looked frustrated but not surprised. He said Zeke was smart and paranoid, which made him dangerous and hard to catch. He said they'd found something interesting, though. During the chase, one of the pursuing officers had spotted Zeke throwing something from his car window. They'd gone back and recovered a burner phone from the roadside. Cleary said forensics was already working on data extraction, and they'd have results within a day or 2. I went home and tried calling my mom again. Still no answer. I sent her a text saying I loved her and I was sorry for everything. She didn't respond. Cleary called me 2 days later with an update about the burner phone. He said the data extraction had revealed partial contact lists and location pings from the past week. He'd mapped out several addresses Zeke had visited, including a pawn shop downtown on 5th Street. He said they were getting a warrant to search the pawn shop and interview the owner. He said this could be the break they needed to connect Zeke directly to selling the stolen jewelry. I asked if this meant my cooperation was still necessary, and he said Jefferson would make that call based on what they found. The waiting was torture. I couldn't work because I'd been suspended. I couldn't sleep because my shoulder still hurt and my mind wouldn't stop racing. My mom still wasn't returning my calls, and the silence from her felt worse than anything Zeke had done to me. Police executed the warrant on the pawn shop the next morning. Cleary called me that afternoon sounding energized. He said the owner had been reluctant at first, but eventually admitted purchasing jewelry matching descriptions from the robbery case. He'd provided security footage showing Zeke selling the items over multiple visits during the past 2 months. The detective had seized the recovered pieces as evidence, and they matched several items from the original stolen inventory. He said this was solid proof Zeke had possessed and profited from the robbery proceeds. He said Jefferson was reviewing everything to determine how it affected the case against both of us. Justina called me the next day, and her tone was different. She said Jefferson had reviewed the new evidence from the pawn shop, and it was changing the prosecutor's strategy. She said they were building a strong case against Zeke independently of my testimony. She said this weakened my negotiating position because my cooperation was becoming less critical to their prosecution. She said the deal Jefferson had offered was now less generous. Instead of probation, she was talking about jail time with credit for cooperation. Instead of reduced charges, she was talking about pleading to the original accessory counts. Justina said we needed to decide quickly before Jefferson pulled any deal off the table completely. I asked what she recommended, and she was quiet for a moment before saying it depended on how much risk I was willing to take at trial. My mom finally called that evening. Her voice sounded hollow and tired when I answered. She said she needed time to process everything, but she didn't want me to go to prison. She said she'd been thinking about the money I used for her treatment and how it came from someone else's suffering. She said she felt sick knowing that man had died because of what Zeke did, and that I'd helped make it possible by taking my share. She said she loved me, but she was disappointed in a way that hurt worse than any of the physical injuries I'd received. I tried to explain about being desperate and scared, but she cut me off. She said explanations didn't change what happened. She said I needed to accept responsibility and face whatever consequences came. Then she hung up before I could respond. Cleary called again 2 days later with another development. He said the pawn shop owner was facing charges himself for receiving stolen property. He said the owner had decided to cooperate fully to reduce his own sentence. He'd provided information about a fence who'd connected Zeke to other robberies over the past year. He'd given names and locations and transaction records. Jefferson was excited because this opened up the possibility of building a conspiracy case that could bring down a larger criminal network. Cleary said this meant even less pressure on me to cooperate because they had multiple witnesses now. He said Jefferson might withdraw the cooperation deal entirely and just prosecute me straight up for my role in the original robbery. I hung up and sat on my couch staring at nothing. Everything was falling apart and I had no control over any of it. Justina called the next morning and said I needed to make a decision immediately because Jefferson was getting ready to pull the cooperation deal off the table completely. She said the prosecutor had enough witnesses now that my testimony wasn't critical anymore, which meant I had no leverage left. She said if I wanted to avoid serious prison time, I needed to sign the agreement today, right now, before Jefferson changed her mind. I met Justina at her office an hour later, and she had the cooperation agreement printed out and ready. The document was 12 pages long and spelled out everything I'd have to do. I had to provide full truthful testimony about the robbery, the money I took, everything I saw Zeke do that night. I had to testify at any hearings or trials they needed me for. I had to turn over any evidence I still had. In exchange, I'd get probation instead of prison and restitution payments instead of full sentencing. Justina handed me a pen and pointed to the signature line. My hand shook as I signed my name, knowing I was committing to testifying against my best friend of 8 years and admitting my own guilt in open court. The ink looked dark and permanent on the white paper. 3 days later, Cleary called me sounding excited. He said they got a hit on the bolo for Zeke when a walk-in clinic on the east side reported treating a man with a suspicious stab wound who'd given a fake name and paid cash. The clinic staff got nervous about the injury and the way the guy acted, so they called it in after he left. Officers were waiting in the parking lot when Zeke came out and they arrested him right there. Cleary said Zeke was still limping badly from where I'd stabbed him with the broken bat, and the wound looked infected because he'd waited too long to get treatment. They took him straight to county jail and booked him on multiple charges. The prosecutor filed formal charges against Zeke the next day. Home invasion, aggravated assault, witness intimidation, and illegal possession of a firearm. Jefferson told Cleary she was still reviewing whether they had enough new evidence to recharge Zeke for the original jewelry store robbery, despite the previous acquittal. The double jeopardy laws made it tricky, but she thought the new evidence from the pawn shop and the fence might give them an angle. Cleary said they were building the strongest case possible to make sure Zeke stayed locked up for a long time. Then Jefferson filed charges against me too, accessory after the fact to armed robbery. My arraignment got scheduled for the following week, and Justina called to walk me through what would happen. She said the arraignment was just a formality where I'd enter my plea, and the judge would set bail and trial dates. She reminded me about 50 times that my cooperation deal was totally dependent on me being completely honest in my testimony. If I lied or held anything back, the deal was void, and I'd face the full charges with no help from the prosecutor. She said I needed to understand how serious this was, and how one mistake could send me to prison for years. My boss called me that same afternoon. His voice was cold and formal when he said the company was terminating my employment, effective immediately. He cited the criminal charges and the negative publicity affecting the company's reputation. He said they couldn't have someone facing felony charges representing their business. I tried to explain about the cooperation deal and how I was helping prosecute the actual criminal, but he cut me off. He said the decision was final and my last paycheck would be mailed to me. I hung up and stared at my phone, realizing I was now unemployed with criminal charges hanging over me and legal fees eating through my savings account every single day. The news coverage got worse after my arraignment. Local stations ran stories about the jewelry store robbery case and identified me as being involved. They showed my mugshot next to Zeke's and talked about how we'd been friends for years. Neighbors started acting different immediately. Alvin Pugh, who lived 3 houses down, used to wave and chat when we saw each other getting mail or taking out trash. Now when I saw him outside, he looked away and crossed the street rather than walk past me. Other neighbors did the same thing. Nobody made eye contact anymore. Nobody said hello. I could feel their judgment and fear every time I left my house. My reputation in this neighborhood was completely destroyed, and I knew I'd have to move eventually because nobody would ever look at me the same way again. Justina spent the next 2 weeks negotiating the specific terms of my plea agreement with Jefferson. They went back and forth on the details until finally settling on 2 years probation, 300 hours of community service, and $15,000 in restitution to the victim's family. The restitution amount was based on my share of the stolen money that I'd used for my mom's cancer treatment. Justina explained that the court calculated it as my portion of responsibility for the crime, even though Zeke was the one who actually committed the robbery and assault. I'd have to make monthly payments for years to pay it all back. The plea agreement also required me to testify fully and truthfully at any proceedings related to the case. If I completed all the terms successfully, my record could potentially be expunged after 5 years. But that wasn't guaranteed. Meanwhile, the fence who'd bought jewelry from Zeke decided to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges on his own case. He provided detailed records of every transaction he'd done with Zeke over the past year. The records showed dates, descriptions of items, prices paid, and even had photos of some pieces. His testimony helped establish the full scope of the robbery and proved that Zeke had been actively trying to profit from the stolen goods for months. Jefferson was excited about this evidence because it showed planning and intent and ongoing criminal activity rather than just one isolated incident. My preliminary hearing happened 3 weeks after my arraignment. I sat in the witness chair with my hand on a Bible and swore to tell the truth. Then I testified about the night of the robbery. I described watching Zeke pistol whip the jewelry store owner until his face was unrecognizable. I talked about the old man begging and mentioning his grandchildren while Zeke just kept hitting him. I admitted that I took my cut of the money, $20,000, and used it to pay for my mom's cancer treatment. I explained how I'd sat in my car that night feeling sick, while Zeke counted the bloody bills and pocketed the store owner's tooth as some kind of trophy. Zeke's defense attorney attacked me during cross-examination. He suggested I was lying to save myself from prison. He pointed out that I'd waited months to come forward and only cooperated after getting caught with evidence in my yard. He implied I was the real mastermind and Zeke was just my muscle. But I stuck to the truth and answered every question as honestly as I could because my cooperation deal and my freedom depended on it. Zeke sat at the defense table the whole time looking completely calm and controlled. He never showed any anger or emotion while I testified against him. He didn't glare at me or shake his head or react in any visible way. His face stayed neutral and almost pleasant, like he was watching something mildly interesting on television rather than hearing his former best friend describe his crimes in detail. That composure was somehow more unsettling than if he'd been staring daggers at me or mouthing threats. It reminded me of all the times over 8 years when I'd watched him manipulate people in situations with that same calculated control. He'd always been able to hide what he was really thinking and feeling and sitting there in that courtroom watching him sit so calmly at the defense table, I recognized that this was just another performance from someone who'd spent his whole life learning how to fake being normal. The prosecution called Detective Cleary next, and he walked to the witness stand carrying a thick folder of evidence reports. He testified about the blood samples collected from my living room floor and how the lab matched them to Zeke's blood type. He explained they found the crowbar during a search of Zeke's apartment, with my blood still on the metal surface. The chain of custody documentation was perfect this time, with every step recorded and verified by multiple officers. Zeke's defense attorney tried to challenge the evidence collection procedures, but Cleary had photographs and timestamps for everything. The detective described finding glass fragments embedded in both our blood samples, proving we fought in my house exactly like I said. He showed the jury pictures of my destroyed living room, with the smashed coffee table and bullet holes in the walls. The defense couldn't break down his testimony because every piece of evidence was documented properly and connected directly to the home invasion. When Cleary stepped down, I felt a small weight lift, knowing the physical proof backed up my story. My mom showed up at the courthouse the day of my sentencing hearing. I spotted her in the back row sitting alone with her purse clutched in her lap. She looked tired and thin from the cancer treatments, but she came anyway. We didn't speak before the hearing started, but when I glanced back at her, she gave me one small nod. That nod meant more than any words could have because it told me she was still my mom despite everything I'd done. I faced forward and tried to focus on what the judge was saying about my cooperation and genuine remorse. My mom's presence in that courtroom felt like she was telling me she hadn't given up on me completely, even though I'd disappointed her in the worst possible way. The judge reviewed my plea agreement and asked if I understood the terms. I said yes and explained I was pleading guilty to accessory after the fact to robbery. The judge sentenced me to 2 years probation with 300 hours of community service and $15,000 in restitution to the victim's family. I was grateful I wouldn't go to prison, but the criminal record would follow me forever. Finding decent work would be hard, and the restitution payments would take years to complete on whatever low-wage jobs would hire someone with my background. The judge warned me that any violation of probation terms would result in immediate jail time. I promised to comply with everything, and meant it because I'd gotten a second chance most people in my situation never received. Zeke's trial on the home invasion and assault charges took 3 weeks. The jury heard all the evidence about him breaking into my house and threatening me with a gun. They convicted him on most counts, including aggravated assault and illegal possession of a firearm. The jury deadlocked on the witness intimidation charge because some members felt the prosecution hadn't proven it beyond reasonable doubt. The judge sentenced Zeke to 8 years in prison with possibility of parole after 5. He showed no reaction when the sentence was announced, just sat there with that same calm expression he'd worn throughout the trial. I watched him get led away in handcuffs and felt a mix of relief and sadness for what our friendship had become. The prosecutor met with Justina and me to explain they wouldn't retry Zeke for the original jewelry store robbery. Double jeopardy rules meant he couldn't be charged again for the same crime after his acquittal. It frustrated me that he'd never face justice for beating that old man to death, but at least he was locked up for what he did to me. The prosecutor said they'd done everything possible within the law, and sometimes that had to be enough. I left the courthouse that day knowing the store owner's family would never get full justice, but hoping they found some peace, knowing Zeke was in prison. I moved to a smaller apartment across town where rent was cheaper, and nobody knew my history. The place was older, with thin walls and a bathroom that needed work, but it was mine and it was clean. I started my community service at a food bank sorting donations and helping pack boxes for families in need. The work was simple, but it felt good to do something helpful after everything I'd done wrong. The other volunteers didn't ask about my past, and I didn't volunteer the information. I focused on showing up on time and working hard and slowly building a routine that gave my days structure and purpose. My mom called to tell me she was starting a new round of chemotherapy and asked if I'd visit. I drove to her house every Sunday afternoon, and we'd sit in her living room drinking tea and talking about small things. She told me she was still angry and disappointed, but she loved me and believed I could become a better person. She said I needed to spend the rest of my life making choices that honored the second chance I'd been given. I promised her I would and meant it, even though I knew actions mattered more than promises. Those weekly visits became the most important part of my week because they reminded me why I needed to stay on the right path. I found part-time work at a warehouse loading trucks and moving inventory. The manager was willing to hire people with criminal records and didn't ask too many questions about my past. The pay was low, and the work was physically hard with early morning shifts that left me exhausted. But it was honest work, and I showed up every day determined to prove I was reliable. I used my paychecks to make my restitution payments on time every month and cover my basic living expenses. The job wasn't glamorous, but it kept me busy and gave me a sense of accomplishment. 6 months after everything fell apart, I was living a smaller and harder life than before. I attended my probation meetings every 2 weeks and passed every drug test. I worked my warehouse shifts and completed my community service hours at the food bank. I visited my mom every Sunday and slowly rebuilt her trust through consistent presence and honesty. My apartment was small and my bank account was nearly empty, but I didn't carry the weight of Zeke's violence anymore. I understood that redemption wasn't something you achieved and then celebrated. It was a daily choice to do better than you did before, and to keep making that choice even when it was difficult and the progress felt invisible. Well, that's the grand conclusion you didn't know you needed. If you're still here, I'm both flattered and slightly concerned. Might as well subscribe, clearly, you've already committed to the chaos.